I'm not made for all this running around.
If you asked me what my favorite video game genre was, without a doubt, I'd go with platformers. Huh. Felt a bit of deja vu there. But yeah, as commonplace of a genre as it's been over the years, I really enjoy platformers. Whether that be more traditional 2D platformers, or ones that do a little bit more either in level design or gameplay mechanics, or of course, 3D platformers. My childhood was largely spent in the GameCube era of gaming, so 3D platformers were aplenty growing up, combined with also having access to the previous generation and some of what it had to offer for the genre. The Crash Bandicoot trilogy, the 3D Mario platformers, the Sonic Adventure games, countless hours were spent in all of these. But you all know how this video series works, we're not here to talk about those. With how successful games like those were proved to be, it was no surprise that other companies threw their hat into the ring and made their own 3D platformers over the years. And because there was so many, quite a few fell under the radar. But as we've learned in the past, sometimes there's some really underappreciated gems hidden among those lost games. So I'm going to take this opportunity to dig through and see how some of these obscure 3D platformers are. And it seems many of you were excited for this as well. When I first asked for suggestions on this topic, I got tons of games brought to my attention. Like, well over 100. Seems like I might be doing more than one of these videos, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. For now, let's focus on the games I've got for this video. And to start things off, I've got a childhood favorite here. Space Station Silicon Valley for the N64. Released back in 1998, this was one of the last few games developed by studio DMA Design, then known for the Lemmings series, before they were rebranded into Rockstar North. Yes, as in Grand Theft Auto Rockstar North. This here's a game that I played quite a lot growing up, though admittedly, I actually hadn't beaten it before playing it again for this video. Or at least, not properly. This game was far too hard for younger me to complete, so once I found out there were in-game cheat codes that unlock each world's levels, I just used that to try out some of the game's later levels, including the final level. So I had technically beaten the game before, just not in its entirety up until now. Because of that, this playthrough was simultaneously a familiar experience and a new experience for me. So yeah, this ought to be interesting. The game takes place in the 31st century, starting with this charmingly presented news report about how Silicon Valley, a space station that launched and subsequently disappeared into deep space 1,000 years ago, has re-emerged and is heading straight for Earth. And all attempts so far to infiltrate the space station have proven futile. So, to save on costs and the lives of good troops, that's actually the reason given in the manual, the government sends in Dan Danger and Evo, a duo of heroes so incompetent that they literally get into a physical fight over the music on the radio. Side note, I love that as they're flying out of control, Dan's first priority upon regaining consciousness is to change the radio again. To no surprise, their landing on the space station is a crash landing, with Evo's delayed ejection resulting in his body being smashed into pieces. So now it's up to you as Evo, with Dan Danger as support, to make your way through the space station, recover your body parts, and stop whatever nefarious plot may be afoot. And while you don't have your body anymore, you're not entirely helpless. Space Station Silicon Valley's main gameplay gimmick is that, as Evo's spider-like microchip, you can take control of any of the space station's robot animals once they've been deactivated, with these serving as your means of traversing the levels. So yeah, it's basically Mario Odyssey nearly 20 years before Mario Odyssey. You're able to swap between animal bodies freely when you come across a deactivated one, which you're going to be doing a lot of throughout the game. Space Station Silicon Valley is largely a puzzle platformer, with each of the animals' various abilities being your means of figuring out said puzzles. And there's a very large variety of animals throughout the game, especially since some of the animals have merged with other pieces of tech. So while you'll start off with animals like dogs and sheep, you'll later find yourself using turtle tanks, helicopter rabbits, desert foxes with machine guns, and so on and so forth. The game does a generally great job with using each animal to the fullest in the environments they're placed in, though I will admit that some animals are definitely more fun to use than others. Some of the ones you're required to use at points move unbelievably slow, and especially in some of the later levels, your patience will be tested. But more often than not, these animals are fun to use. The game goes with a level-by-level structure, with each level having set objectives given to you to activate the exit teleporter. These can range from tasks like collecting items spread throughout the level, turning something on or off, or very commonly, killing and or taking control of a specific animal, the last of which I want to focus on. Throughout the game, you're going to be tasked to take down animals that, with the animal you've got, seems like an impossibility to defeat. Like, you just don't seem to be strong enough to do the job. Well, in several cases, there's actually a way you can work around this. The animal AI have natural enemies of sorts. Like if you're playing as a sheep or ram and an enemy dog sees you, it will go after you. However, this also applies between enemy AI. So oftentimes the solution is not to kill the enemy yourself, but let a different enemy do it for you. For example, one level requires you to take control of this bear, but as this tiny mouse, yeah, no, not happening. However, there's a dog with missiles nearby, who, as I learned from a previous level, will naturally get into a fight with the bear. So instead, I lured them together and got them to fight it out. That allowed me to take control of the dog, which in turn allowed me to take out the bear. Moments like these feel great. However, in other cases, the game will expect you to just brute force it and take out the enemy yourself, and that often will result in just getting decimated by the enemy. Not helped by the fact that there are no lives or checkpoints, so if you get killed, you're restarting the level from scratch, and many of these levels aren't short. Because of that, it does not take long for this game to hit pretty big difficulty spikes when it comes to combat. Now, there are other issues with the game beyond this, like the aforementioned movement speed of some animals, the levels and objectives feeling generally less creative in the second half of the game, occasional camera issues, though that was pretty par for the course during that time, and the on-rail shooter level at the end of the jungle world. Seriously, that level is terrible. But even despite those, Space Station Silicon Valley is a game that I feel has some really solid strengths that, more often than not, help make those weaker aspects not as apparent. The game's got itself both a nice charm with some of the animal interactions, such as when you save these mice from a machine that brutally transformed them into rats, and a pretty entertaining sense of humor, courtesy of Dan Danger. The man's the epitome of unprofessional, with his mission briefs and listed objectives often saying stuff like, turn on the big computer thing, or being used to just let out whatever's on his mind, from threats to Evo, to disgust to the peaceful nature of some of the environments. Heck, there's one level where he's feeling so frustrated that one of the objectives that he gives you is to blow up all the music speakers in the level so the level's music will stop playing. Actually, on that note, that's another thing I really like about this game, the attention to detail. The music, which is pretty great by the way, will play out of these speakers in the levels, with it dynamically getting louder or quieter depending on your distance from the speaker. And heck, some animals will bob their heads or tap their feet to the beat of the level's song. On top of that, when you take control of an animal for the first time, you get this really cool sequence that breaks down the animal's features, their abilities, and details about how they're built mechanically. Most of it is just flavor text, but some of it will actually reveal crucial information about the animal, such as how high they can fall before they take fall damage, or if they're water resistant or not. And cleverly, their abilities are listed as Skill A and Skill B, which correlate to the button you'll be pressing to use said ability. So yeah, while it's got some pretty notable issues, Space Station Silicon Valley is still a good time all around. The idea alone carries it a long way and makes it a personal favorite when it comes to N64 games. And I would like to see how it could be fleshed out more. I know I mentioned Mario Odyssey earlier, but even still. Though not too long ago, there was a report that Toys for Bob, the creators of Spyro Reignited Trilogy and Crash Bandicoot 4, wanted to take a shot at remaking this game. I'd be down for that. Oh, also, quick fun fact. This game's impossible to 100%. Every level's got a secret objective that will reward you with one of these golden statues of sorts. But one of the level's golden statues didn't have collision added, making it literally impossible to pick up, and thus, the game's impossible to officially 100%. Which is extra unfortunate, as there actually is a secret level you access by 100%ing the game. Granted, it's just an asteroids minigame, but yeah. Fortunately, with those previously mentioned level cheat codes, it is still unlockable, so there you go. For our next game, we're jumping up a generation, while also entering a very notable field from this era of games, the licensed game. The 3D platformer was a very popular genre for licensed games, especially those based on animated films and TV shows. And while some of those licensed 3D platformers were actually good, like the Toy Story 2 game, many of them, well, aren't. I could probably do a whole video just on licensed 3D platformers, but for this video, we'll just take a look at a couple of them. And to start, how's about we look at some Wallace and Gromit? I'm sure many of you are familiar with this series, but to those who aren't, Wallace and Gromit is a series of British-made stop-motion animated films and shorts. Arguably the most popular stop-motion series out there, actually. It's a pretty charming series, focusing on the cheese-loving inventor Wallace and his loyal dog, and often the one to get them out of trouble, Gromit, and the hijinks they get into often as a result of Wallace's inventions. I watched the original trio of short films a ton as a kid, and if I recall correctly, I even saw their full-length film Curse the Were-Rabbit in theaters. So upon discovering back in the day that there was a Wallace and Gromit game on the fancy new console I got the Christmas before, I knew I had to give it a try. So yeah, my second ever GameCube game, my first being Double Dash, which came with the console when we got it, was Wallace and Gromit in Project Zoo, though it also came out on PS2 and Xbox. This was another game I didn't actually end up beating as a kid, but I did get around to doing so a couple years ago, rather than this playthrough being the first time I finished the game. Though admittedly, because I knew what to expect, I wasn't looking forward to playing this game as much, because it's kinda rough, to put it simply. Now with that said, I do actually like the premise. It's a kind of sequel to one of the original short films, namely The Wrong Trousers. At the end of that film, the villainous penguin Feathers McGraw got locked up in a zoo for his crimes. And in this game, Feathers has taken over the zoo and turned it into his own base of operations, holding the zoo's baby animals captive to force the other animals to do his bidding. He's also got a young polar bear named Archie as a hostage, but Archie just so happens to be sponsored by Wallace, who is planning on visiting the zoo with Gromit for Archie's birthday. This in turn gets Feathers' plan on the duo's radar, and they infiltrate the zoo to put a stop to Feathers and save Archie and the zoo animals. The game does have the same general charm as those original short films, particularly in the writing. It's not quite as witty as them, granted, but it does have the same feel. And there's even some cute references to the original short films.
I wonder who does their windows.
It certainly helps that they got Wallace's original voice actor, the late Peter Sallis, to reprise his role for the game. But unfortunately, Wallace did start to get a bit irritating compared to in the films. Though my irritation with Wallace here could also be because of his involvement in the gameplay, which I'll get into now. Project Zoo is a partly linear, partly explorative 3D platformer, with the main collectible of sorts being the baby zoo animals. Each level will require you to free a baby animal before you can progress, with the exception of one of the mine levels that let me progress even though I hadn't freed the last baby beaver yet. Whoops. You'll largely find yourself jumping around and solving puzzles in this game, with the occasional combat sequence with some of Feathers' robots, which on paper is pretty straightforward, but all this isn't helped by how Gromit controls. His movement feels really heavy, especially in the case of his jump, so undershooting jumps tended to happen pretty frequently. Heck, something as simple as the tutorial section for run jumps I messed up 3 times because of this, which in turn required me to climb my way back up each time. Wasn't too fun. But yeah, Gromit doesn't feel too good to control, and with some of the game's later platforming challenges, it quickly became a source of frustration. You also unlock various weapons as you progress, which you can switch through Ratchet & Clank style, though these are largely used for puzzles. You can use them in combat, but most of them just stun enemies rather than kill them, and their lock-on's not the most reliable, so you'll mostly be using your basic melee attacks for combat portions, which, because of the sluggish movement, make these parts not as fun either. Though you may have noticed that I've only brought up Gromit in regards to control, and that be because, in this game, you only ever play as Gromit. However, since this game is called Wallace and Gromit, Wallace tags along with you at all times, and is often needed to repair machines or to help solve puzzles. In other words, you're dealing with an escort mission for majority of the game. Now fortunately, Wallace can't be killed by most enemies, so it's not like you need to protect him, with the exception of the final level where there's a few parts that you need to keep enemies from getting to him, but he only follows when you tell him to, and he likes to take his own sweet time to get anywhere, so it doesn't take long before he tests your patience. Doesn't help that the interaction button and the whistle for Wallace button are the same button on the controller, so there's many times you'll find yourself wanting to interact with something, and you accidentally whistle for Wallace when you didn't want to. Now, to give the game some credit, I do think it does a decent job of capturing the look of the Wallace and Gromit characters. The behind-the-scenes video in the game's extras goes over how they wanted the character models to look as smooth as their stop-motion counterparts, thus requiring incredibly high polygon counts to ensure this. And while not perfect, for the hardware of the time, they don't look too bad. That said, with the exception of the mine area, I think the environments are kinda boring, and the same goes with the music. It's not bad music, but again, with the exception of the mine area, and the classic main theme of course, it's a very forgettable OST. Okay, actually there is one other exception. The game's boss theme is really good. But yeah, overall, I feel that Project Zoo is just kinda bland and not fun to play. It does what it can to capture the feel of a Wallace and Gromit film, which I'll definitely give the dev team props for, but the game itself is pretty frustrating to play, and when it's not frustrating, it's usually just boring. And especially as I got closer to the end of the game, the frustration became more and more frequent. That final level especially was really bad. Now I know Project Zoo's dev studio, Frontier Developments, went on to do the tie-in game for Curse the Were-Rabbit, so maybe they did a better job on their second outing? I wouldn't know though, because it never got a GameCube version, and by the time I got a PS2, PS2 games weren't being sold as much, so I never got around to giving it a try. But either way, I wasn't very fond of Project Zoo. Also, while not a broken mess, I did experience some weird glitches with this game, from getting stuck on terrain, to teleporting out of an elevator at one point.
Maybe we should get moving. I'm staying here, Gromit.
To a point where I got soft-locked. I needed Wallace to come down and fix a machine that allowed me to progress, but he refused to follow me even though the path was clear. After trying multiple times to get him to follow, I threw myself into the lava to reset the area and hopefully fix this. But when I respawned, he had magically teleported to where I needed him to be. Needless to say, I was a bit annoyed at Wallace after that.
Less of that now.
But that's not all I have for licensed 3D platformers today. Among all the animation studios making tie-in games at the time, Disney was one of the most prominent in that regard. A majority of the mainline Disney animated movies in the 90s and 2000s got licensed games. Heck, even some of the straight-to-DVD sequels did. To varying degrees of quality. And one of those movies that got the licensed game treatment was none other than the underrated gem, Treasure Planet. Now, unlike Wallace and Gromit, I didn't have much of a nostalgic connection to Treasure Planet. I did see it as a kid, but it was a movie that I kind of forgot about until I was older. Upon rewatching it when I was older though, it ended up becoming one of my favorite movies, let alone from Disney's lineup. Now, Treasure Planet actually got two different 3D platformers, one on PS1 and one on PS2. I was planning on looking at both of them, but the PS2 version kept randomly soft-locking me, so I couldn't even get past the first level. A shame too. It seems like it could have ended up being pretty fun. Maybe I'll save the PS2 version for a future video if I can get it working, but for now, I'll just be looking at the PS1 version. Following the film's story pretty closely, the game has you playing as the troubled teen himself, Jim Hawkins, through various parts of his journey to find Treasure Planet. And by pretty closely, I mean really closely. Most licensed games tended to take some creative liberties to extend the game's length, but Treasure Planet sticks entirely to the film's four main locations: Montresor, the spaceport, the RLS Legacy, and Treasure Planet itself. Because of that, this game is not particularly long, but it does get a fair bit out of these locations with pretty lengthy levels, which brings us into the gameplay. Of all 3D platformers to take direct inspiration from, the Treasure Planet game plays a lot like Spyro. That may seem a bit ridiculous to say, given Spyro's a small dragon who runs on all fours, and Jim isn't that, but it's true. He's got two attack types that are both used to open specific containers and attack specific enemies, like how the Flame and Charge were in Spyro. The levels are largely linear, but with some openness to them. The level's goals are to get to the end, but there are side tasks littered around that'll give you collectibles required for long-term progression, and there's a set amount of treasure per level, some of which you'll need to give to someone to continue your way through a level. Heck, using Morph, Jim's able to straight up glide. Like, it's basically Spyro. Now to clarify, I'm not saying this is a bad thing. Even when cut from the same cloth as something else, you can still spin together something that feels original from those concepts. And Treasure Planet does feel different from Spyro. For one, it's not nearly as good. Okay, that was a little blunt. But yeah, Treasure Planet is kinda lacking in areas. For one, the controls. While not as bad as Gromit was in Project Zoo, Jim does feel stiff and heavy to control, even when just moving. It didn't result in accidental deaths nearly as much, granted, but that did occur every so often. Though oddly enough, one of the side tasks, where you attack space rats from a top-down perspective, has much better feeling movement controls than the regular game. Seriously, I wish this was how Jim usually felt to control. Also, while one of Jim's weapons, the laser gun, feels fine to use, the sword puts you at a standstill, making it not really ideal for use outside of breaking open chests and attacking enemies with energy shields. I don't mean to compare to Spyro again, but both of his attacks could be used while moving. Heck, one was entirely reliant on movement, which allowed for a better sense of flow than in Jim's case here. But yeah, the game has you traversing levels largely to get to the end, but also to find these gold treasure tokens, which are used to unlock further levels. These are obtained by completing tasks, breaking open 6 steel treasure chests, finding 4 gold gems and depositing them, just to name the general examples. Pretty standard stuff all around, but the side tasks in particular can definitely range in quality. Most of them are alright, like the previously mentioned Space Rat mission, collecting materials of specific colors, the many shooting gallery challenges, but then in the last level there's a friggin' stealth section as one of the side tasks. And of course, it's one of those stealth sections where you restart from the beginning if you're noticed for even a split second. Seriously, why are stealth sections like this so common in non-stealth games? I can't stand them. And guess what? Out of all the side tasks in the game, the stealth section is the only one that's mandatory. Because of course it is. Though platforming around isn't the only thing these levels have to offer, as every world also has a racing level. where you complete laps of a course either on a Solar Surfer or on the ROS Legacy's Longboat with treasure tokens earned from your overall time. Granted, with the emphasis solar surfing has in the movie, the inclusion of these levels is fitting. But at the same time, I'm now talking about something related to racing games yet again. But anyway, these levels are alright, if a bit long, though the jump with the Solar Surfer is rather unresponsive at points, resulting in a few wipeouts that weren't my fault. And lastly, there are 2 boss fights in the game, one against Scroop, in the spaceport for some reason. Wouldn't it make more sense to have it take place on the Legacy? And one against John Silver. Scroop's fight is just kinda there, but John Silver's fight was actually pretty fun and dynamic, considering me pleasantly surprised. Though speaking of John Silver, while I understand why this is the case, I do find it funny that morphs with you for the entirety of the game, long before Jim meets Silver and Morph in the movie. Interestingly, the PS2 version actually finds a way to work around this, by introducing Silver earlier in the context of the game. And on the topic of characters, something I do really like about this game is that they actually managed to get the film's full voice cast back to reprise their roles.
This is the town of Benbow on the mining planet of Montresor. But then, being born here, you know all that, don't you, Jim?
Ah, Jimbo. Thank you, lad. Now you know what they say. A crew is only 3 miles away from a mutiny.
Pity I'm all out of merit badges, but here, take this as certification that you've achieved the basic space gunnery standard. Carry on.
It's not often that happens in licensed games, and with how strong the voice performances are in the original movie, it's a very welcome surprise. And lastly, while talking about audio, the music's alright. Nothing super memorable, but nothing bad either. Though interestingly, the moment it started, the first thing I thought was, oh, this sounds like music from Shrek Treasure Hunt. And sure enough, upon looking into it, both games were composed by the same company, Game Audio Limited. Though at least Treasure Planet doesn't have abysmal sound balancing like Shrek Treasure Hunt did. Also, both games have treasure in the title, what a funny coincidence. But yeah, that's Treasure Planet on the PS1. Not outright bad, but nothing all that special either. It's a pretty standard licensed 3D platformer. If you're a fan of the movie like I am, you might get something out of getting to explore places like the ROS Legacy, as low poly as it is, but otherwise, you'd get a similar experience elsewhere. So yeah, that's a very small taste of the kind of platformers that were floating about back in the day. I know that's barely scratching the surface of it, but I don't want this video to go on forever. Besides, there's another side of the obscure 3D platformer scene I'd like to take a look at. More specifically, a more recent side of it. Because as uncommon as new 3D platformers in the AAA scene are nowadays, that's where the indie scene comes in. In the past little while, there's been a larger boom of indie 3D platformers. So for the last few games of this video, I wanted to take a look at some examples of obscure indie 3D platformers. And to introduce this next game, I first want to bring up a set of games I talked about pretty recently. Those who watched my favorite games of 2021 video may recall me talking about the Tori games, 2 bite-sized 3D platformers on the Switch with a very PS1 inspired aesthetic, a bird with cool glasses, and some very creepy surprises. Sure, they were incredibly short, but both only costed $1, so I feel that was fair. And hey, for that $1, you get a pretty fun time. Heck, Tori 2 in particular recently got an update that added a few new Christmas-themed levels, so that playtime can be extended even further. Now the reason I bring this all up is because, in both Tori games, there's a couple of secret characters you can unlock, one of which being this adorably dapper bat known as McBat. He sort of breaks the game, as he can jump infinitely and avoid most obstacles as a result, but it's a nice little reward for beating the game. And, as I found out after I made my Games of 2021 video, McBat was actually from another 3D platformer from the same developer as the Tori games, known as McBat 64. And, well, here I am to talk about it now. So actually, this is going to be an interesting game to talk about, as it's less so a traditional platformer and more so a time capsule. As the name implies, McBat 64 takes great amounts of inspiration from the N64 era, and each of its bite-sized levels are made to capture the look and feel of various games from across the N64's library. The most notable of these inspirations is, pretty evidently, Banjo-Kazooie, but its homages go beyond that. For instance, one level has you collecting a sword, shield, and cap before entering a puzzle-filled dungeon. Take a wild guess what this is meant to be. One level puts you on a 2D plane in an environment that feels like a mix of Kirby 64 and Yoshi's Story, and of course, there's even a kart racing level. Why wouldn't there be? It's not the most challenging game out there, in fact it's actually really easy, but like I said earlier, I think it's more so meant to be like a time capsule, capturing the look and feel of that era in a small bubble, which honestly, yeah, it really nails it in that regard. Though the fun really kicks off when you've unlocked the special unlimited jump ability, allowing you to clip out of the environment and find hidden collectibles that take you to secret areas. These can range from an alleyway that I imagine was some kind of fixed camera testing room, to a Sonic Adventure themed environment, to this. I mean, it does look cool, I'll give it that. But yeah, I'd recommend Macbeth 64 more so to people familiar with that older era of gaming, as this is more of a cozy nostalgia trip than a challenging platformer. It's on Steam, Switch, and itch.io, and it's only $2. So give it a go if you want to feel nostalgic for classic era video games. Also, one of the levels has a DeLorean with Banjo-Kazooie-esque googly eyes. This is something I didn't know I wanted in my life until now. Though, if you'd like an indie 3D platformer that calls back to that era that's also a challenging game, have I got just the treat for you. I mentioned this in my Games of 2021 video, but last year there was this Nintendo's Direct style showcase called Hub World, dedicated to showing off recent and upcoming indie 3D platformers. I do honestly hope they do it again this year. But anyway, one of the games from it that stuck out to me, alongside the Tory games, was this one game called Silo Sybil? I'll admit I'm not 100% sure how to pronounce it. But anyway, Silo Sybil was one of the games showcased, and I recently picked it up to see how it was. It's currently on Steam Early Access, but the developer, Bad Vertex, is aiming to have the full release out at some point this year, which will include more levels, boss fights, and even a few cutscenes apparently. But until then, Bad Vertex has been releasing pretty frequent updates to the Early Access version, adding new levels and all. Heck, by the time this video comes out, there might be a new level in the game that wasn't there when I played it. Who knows? But anyway, let's give this game a look. In its current state, there's no cutscenes or anything, but going off dialogue from NPCs found at the end of each level, I was able to gather that an evil boar sorcerer, if you will, named Lord Nutmeg, has taken over a kingdom of mushroom people, and it's up to you, the mushroom girl Sybil, to stop him and his forces. Pretty straightforward story, and fitting given the source of inspiration. As you can probably tell from the gameplay snippets I've shown, Silo Sybil is heavily inspired by Crash Bandicoot. And I don't mean the series as a whole, I mean Crash Bandicoot, like specifically the first game. Silo Sybil feels very much like a modern indie take on the same sort of gameplay Crash 1 had, right down to the moveset consisting of simply a jump and a basic attack. In Sybil's case, a slap attack with a very satisfying sound effect. The jumps even got the same kind of heaviness that Crash had in that first PS1 outing. But overall, I do feel Sybil controls better than Crash did in the first game, and as such, deaths very rarely felt like a control issue. Which of course there were many deaths, because Silo Sybil proudly markets itself as a mercilessly difficult game, and having beaten it, I can definitely agree. Many of the levels feel on par with some of Crash 1's hardest, like we're talking Stormy Ascent hard. And I'd argue some levels go even beyond that point, but we'll get there when we get there. Though yeah, this game's inspiration is worn quite clearly on its sleeves, feeling more like a direct follow-up to Crash 1 than even Crash 2 did. That said, not everything from Crash 1 carries over. For instance, there's no dumb limited save system locked behind certain completion requirements, so that's a relief. Also, it's got a sort of creative spin on level collectibles. Instead of having crates to break open, every level in Silo Sybil is full of its own collectible, usually a mushroom of some kind. And by finding all of them in a level, you can free that level's mushroom person at the end. But there's an additional catch. Instead of having gem routes, there's secret routes unlocked by having all of a specific level's collectible. So say for example, you get all the collectibles in the first level. Now, any secret route that's connected to that specific collectible is now available. Don't know if that made sense, but either way, it is a pretty creative spin on both the completion aspect of Crash levels and on the gem route formula. And by pausing mid-level, you can see if you'll need a specific collectible for said level and if you've already gotten it or not. So that's handy. Additionally, there's extra special tasks for you to do to unlock various costumes for Sybil, though you do have a few available from the get-go. To no surprise, I used her marsupial color palette for most of my playthrough, but I did unlock some of the other costumes along the way. But yeah, Silo Sybil is one of those pleasant cases of taking inspiration from a specific source and actually doing it better in my opinion. Seriously, I do think this does a better job of being Crash 1 than Crash 1 does. And all while still having its own unique look, which on that note, this game visually feels like it got teleported right out of the 90s. Like, this game captures the PS1 aesthetic pretty much perfectly. That said, as fun of a time as I had with Silo Sybil, I definitely can't recommend this game to everyone, because if you didn't like how hard Crash 1 got, you are not going to like this game. And while its difficulty does largely come down to well-designed difficulty, there are a few cases where it feels like deaths are the game's fault rather than your own. Namely, when the camera decides to get funky with perspective at points. It made some precise jumps harder than they probably should have been. And on the topic of deaths that don't feel like your own fault, the second last level is torturous. There are so many instances throughout that level that expect pixel perfection in your movement. And if you're even just an an inch off, you're dead. This level was honestly really frustrating. And oddly enough, the level after it isn't as hard. Definitely hard, but not as aggravatingly so, even despite the lack of checkpoints in it. I actually really like this last level, having you climb up a revolving tower and dealing with a variety of obstacles in the process. It's pretty unique for a Crash-like game, though the final battle against Lord Nutmeg afterwards was brutal. The bosses currently in the game overall were pretty hard, but Lord Nutmeg especially was oof. It's a lot of pattern memorization, with little room for error. This fight genuinely took me over an hour total to beat, over 40 minutes of which being just in the first phase. Like I said, I wouldn't recommend this game to people who don't enjoy brutally hard games. But even then, Silo Simple was a fun time, even when I was getting my butt kicked by it. Well, aside from that second last level and the last boss, those weren't fun. It does a great job of capturing what it's going for though, both aesthetically and gameplay wise. And all in all, I look forward to the game's full release. Best of luck with this project, Bad Vertex. I know you're a one-man team, but going off of this early access build, I think you can pull it off. And with that, we've got one more game to cover for this video. Alright, let's see what we've got. Oh boy. Those of you who have been around long enough probably remember this game, but to those unaware, one of the first videos I did after my channel rebranding was a review on the then recently released Skylar and Pluck's Adventure on Clover Island. And those who saw that video can testify that I really didn't like this game. But to be perfectly honest, in the 5 years since I made that video, I felt pretty guilty about the way I went about making it. I was still figuring out my review style, and was giving the funny angry reviewer thing a try, with this game being my unfortunate victim. And looking back, I feel like I was way too mean to the game. Sure, I didn't like it, but making jokes about wanting the characters to die? Claiming the developers were lazy? Come on past me, those were just uncalled for. So because of that, I want to give the game a revisit and see how it fares for me now, with more experience both in reviewing and in how game development works. Though this time, instead of looking at the PS4 version, I'm going to be playing the Steam version, as I have been informed that it is the better version of the game. To catch up those who don't know about this game, Skylar and Plucks was developed by Right Nice Games and published by Grip Digital. Released in 2017, shortly before the boom of 3D platformers that was the Insane Trilogy, A Hat in Time, and Mario Odyssey. The game centers on Skylar, a lynx who's been mind-wiped and turned to a cyborg by the evil CRT, who she was attempting to steal something from. However, upon making her escape, Skylar crash lands on Clover Island, where she meets an owl named Plucks, who helps lead her to an energy source called the Siphon, which CRT seeks to claim for himself. With help from the elder of the tribe inhabiting the Siphon Valley, Skylar and Plucks are sent across the island to find the Siphon's 3 fuses, which separated when CRT tried to take the Siphon's power. And that's the story and objective in a nutshell. Explore Clover Island, find the fuses, and take down CRT. Though things do evolve a bit more story-wise as you progress, which leads us into an aspect that I still feel the same about all these years later. The writing's pretty bad. Let's start with the storytelling aspect. Plucks' main thing throughout the game is that he's been biding his time on Clover Island waiting for his father to come back, something he's been waiting for quite some time now. He even mentions as such throughout the game.
Let's not be away for too long. I'm waiting for my papa to come and get me. He'll be back any day now. I used to come up here when I was little. Well, littler. I'd look up at the sky, wondering if Papa was out there somewhere, on his way back. Far away from Sunny Smile Owls now. Sure hope Papa doesn't come back to get me while we're still away.
But then randomly near the end of the game, he just goes off about how he's accepted that his father's not coming back and that he's moving on.
Thought I heard you whining about your precious daddy coming to save you. Do you actually think he'll come back for you?
No, I don't. For whatever reason, he's not coming back. And I know that now. But I'm moving on.
Okay, I guess that subplot resolved itself. Funny enough, on a related note, CRT also has some father issues. Though in his case, it's that he's the son of a tyrannical ruler, and has been exiled until he can prove himself worthy. It's not something the game goes too deep into until the end, but you know what? It works as a motive. There's also a ton of lore tidbits you're given, both from dialogue exchanges and from talking with the people, known as the Loa, in Siphon Valley. And it really feels like it wants to have this expansive lore, but doesn't really utilize it all too well in the game. Not that it all has to be directly related to the plot, but with how many terms are thrown at you lore-wise, it kinda just feels like meaningless fluff at many points. But of course, I know many of you are wanting me to get to the other side of the writing, and that's its attempt at comedy. The game tries to go for witty banter between the characters, largely between Plux and CRT, with some inputs from CRT's assistant Bob, and to give some credit, some of the jokes do actually work.
This rock is just asking to get punched down from here.
Hey! What did that rock ever do to you? Come on now, kitten. There's no need for this tantrum you're pulling. I've forgiven all that you've done. I saved your life, remember?
But sir, you deleted her.
Shut up, Bob.
But more often than not, the jokes don't really work. Now granted, I'll admit I don't feel angry or annoyed by these bad jokes like I did back in the day. They feel more like bad jokes you'd hear in a children's cartoon. You know, stuff like,
Ha! CRT? Does that stand for a cranky robot turd or something?
the voice acting doesn't really help with that either. Not that Plux or CRT's voice actors are outright terrible. CRT's voice actors actually got some pretty solid moments here and there, but some of their deliveries do make potentially funny jokes less funny, and already not funny jokes less not very funny.
You maniacs! You blew it up! Ah, dang you! Gosh dang you all, you smell!
But yeah, the writing doesn't hold up all too well, though it's not quite as, for lack of a better term, cringy as I remember it being. It's more so just cheesy bad. Though yes, there is one bad joke that really sticks out more than the others, and yes, it's the joke you all think it is. Play it.
We came in like a wrecking ball.
Yep, that's still pretty bad. Though that's enough criticizing the writing. Let's get to the gameplay. This was an aspect of the game that I wasn't sure how I'd feel about upon replaying, but with this recent playthrough, I can safely say, I have no idea what my past self was on about. Like, I don't think Skylar and Plux is a hidden masterpiece or anything, but seriously, it's really not as bad as I remember it being gameplay-wise. In fact, I actually had quite a bit of fun with it. Skylar feels solid to control, especially once you unlock the rocket pack and the abilities that come with it. Rocket rolling around in particular was really fun to do, and the other gadgets you unlock do add to that entertainment factor. The Time Orb's slowdown ability is very useful both for certain platforming challenges and for taking down certain enemies, and some of the puzzles it has you do with reverting time back and forth can get quite creative. And the magnetic glove is really fun to use, both for some of the platforming challenges and puzzles it's required for, and especially with picking up turret enemies and using them to clear out an entire room of enemies. The level design and combat sequences often put these various abilities to good use, making for a satisfying gameplay loop. But where the level design shines the most is in finding the Loa. Hidden throughout the game are Loa villagers imprisoned in cages, which can be unlocked with the gems you collect. And by saving enough Loa, the Elder in Siphon Valley can upgrade your max health, incentivizing finding the Loa. When I first played this game, I only found about half the Loa, only going off the beaten path a few times. But this time around, I came to realize that finding those hidden Loa was where the real fun often was. Some of the Loa are incredibly well hidden, encouraging you to explore the area in ways you may not have thought of before. Oftentimes, I'd go out of my way to go off the beaten path in extreme measures, and would be rewarded with finding a Loa. Like, I really didn't give this game enough credit back in the day. Heck, even the sliding piece puzzle that I dreaded really wasn't that bad. Sure, there was a bit of trial and error with that final one, but it really wasn't as frustrating as I remember it being. And I'm not saying this all just to throw some shocking subversion of expectation your way. I genuinely enjoyed playing Skylar and Plux this time. Now granted, it is still a 2-hour game, so I do think $20 may have been a bit too much of a price. But even with its shortcomings, whether it be the writing, or the character model still not looking great, or Plux not really having any gameplay purpose, I do still wish they found a way to incorporate him into the moveset, Skylar and Plux made for a fun time, and I'm glad I went through with playing it again. And I'm also glad I bought the Steam version back when I did, because as of last summer, the game's been delisted on all platforms. Apparently Grip Digital, the publisher, was going through a, quote, crucial change in structures and business vision, which resulted in them delisting a bunch of the games they published, Skylar and Plux included. All without informing the developers of Right Nice Games. It's honestly a shame that this happened to them without warning, especially given how much of a passion project Skylar and Plux was for them. But at the very least, it did manage to get itself a bit of a following before that occurred. In particular, it's gotten itself a dedicated speedrunning community, which is really cool to see. They even found a way to skip right past the wrecking ball scene. That's amazing. Though fortunately, the Skylar and Plux story doesn't end in tragedy. Right Nice Games currently have a self-published Mario Party-esque game in development known as Right Nice Party, but they're also in the midst of working on a Skylar and Plux reboot game. Not a ton of details have been publicly revealed about it yet, but it is encouraging to hear that they're wanting to keep this IP of theirs alive in the grand scheme of things. And especially after playing through the game again, I'm quite excited to see what comes of this new game. And that brings us to the end of today's video. I know this is far from the most the obscure side of the genre has to offer, but I wanted to keep things straightforward to start off. And hey, that just means I've got plenty of material to potentially cover in the future, but we'll worry about that when the time comes. In any case, this has been Black Mage Benjamin, and until the next video, have a nice day everybody!